Brussels when Theresa May meets her fellow EU leaders at the end of the week. But could there be trouble for the Prime Minister back here in Westminster? Some of her own MPs are insisting on a meaningful vote before the end of the Brexit negotiations, and they want that promise written into the EU withdrawal bill that's currently going through Parliament. The Prime Minister faced MPs in the Commons yesterday as she briefed them on the deal she did last week in Brussels.
The progress so far has required give and take for the UK and the EU to move forwards together, and that is what we have done. Of course, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But there is, I believe, a new sense of optimism now in the talks, and I fully hope and expect that we will confirm the arrangements I have set out today in the European Council later this week.
18 months on from the referendum result, the Prime Minister has scraped through phase one of the negotiations. Scraped through after 18 months. 2 months later than planned, with many of the key aspects of phase one still not clear. This weekend, Cabinet members have managed to contradict each other. Indeed, some have managed to go even further and contradict themselves.
Would she confirm that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed? It's a well-known phrase, meaning details can be revisited once you've sorted out what the ultimate destination is, but it doesn't mean that you're going to tear everything up and start all over again on EU citizens and paying money and regulatory convergence if something goes wrong in future.
Last week, we had the humiliating scene of the Prime Minister being forced out of the original deal by the DUP. Rushing back to London, the government had to rewrite the agreement so as to reach the DUP's approval. We really have to wonder, who is running the UK? Is it Arlene Foster or the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead?
The Prime Minister said that there had been give and take in these negotiations, and of course she's absolutely right. We're giving the EU tens of billions of pounds and they're taking them. As the Prime Minister has said, that the money will not be paid unless there's a final agreement. By definition, that must mean that we are not legally obliged to make these payments, otherwise that wouldn't be available to us. So can the Prime Minister explain why she is paying tens of billions of pounds, which are not legally due, to the European Union when she's continuing with a policy of austerity at home that many of my constituents simply do not understand where all this extra money seems to come from?
And I'm joined now by Oliver Letwin, who worked at the heart of both the coalition and David Cameron's short-lived Conservative government as a policy minister and party strategist. Welcome to the programme. Let's pick up on Philip Davis there, the Conservative MP at the end of that film. He's disgruntled about the money, up to £39 billion we've agreed to pay the EU. And he's not the only Conservative backbencher who has raised these concerns, saying that they need help selling this deal to their constituents. How does the government explain to the voting public that we've agreed to make these payments over the coming decades without so far anything to show for it?
Well, I don't actually think that's very difficult. In the first place, this money is money we're already paying for the first large instalments of it, and we just go on paying it for a couple of years and then we stop paying that, which is good news. The rest of the money, about half of it, we pay over 20, 30, 40 years as pensions crystallise and so on. And so the net effect is that after a couple of years, our contribution is hugely reduced, which is good news.
Right. But Theresa May yesterday said the offer is on the table in the context of us agreeing the next stage and the partnership for the future. So let's be absolutely clear. The UK could walk away without paying a penny if the EU doesn't offer us the prospect of a good trade deal in phase two?
Yes, I think there's been quite a lot of confusion about this, actually. As far as I can make out, the position is that there is some unknown quantity which, if one went to court about it, would turn out to be some kind of legal obligation, and that obviously the UK would always pay.
Right, so how much do you think
I don't know, and there hasn't been a legal case to decide. But the next question is that part of it, whatever it is, that isn't legally, we are not legally obliged to pay, and which is part of this agreement, and that is clearly contingent on getting a deal.
Right.
How those would sort themselves out, you'd only know later in court.
So you would agree with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, that we would still need to honour our obligations in that sense, even if we couldn't agree on a trade deal?
Well, I don't think it's a question of whether I agree or Philip says. It's a fact of the matter that the UK always honours its international law obligations. And the government has been totally clear about that. I'm sure the opposition is clear, but that's not a controversial point in our country.
Well, except when you listen to some of the Conservative backbenchers, they seem to be implying that we wouldn't pay any of the amount that's been...
No, I didn't hear the same as you apparently have heard a moment ago. I think your listeners will have heard Philip Davis saying very clearly he thought this money we weren't legally obliged to pay it. Now, as to part of it, I think that may be true. As to another part, it may not be true, and I think we're all agreed that anything we're legally obliged to pay, we'd pay anyway, but we'd only pay anything above what we're legally obliged to pay, and there clearly is some of that, at least, in here, if we get the deal.
Right, well, we may need to see that documentation, because people keep calling for some sort of sheet where...
I don't think you'll ever see that unless and until it were contested in court, because I suspect it's a very complicated question, legally speaking, what are we obliged to pay?
So what if the EU moved to make our offer on the money that we've put down, let's say up to this £39 billion, legally binding before we leave in March 2019?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was completely clear. She's not going to agree to any amount beyond our legal obligations, including the amount she's agreed here, unless and until, finally, we get a final deal that is accepted by Parliament and that becomes the basis of our future relationship. I think that's perfectly clear.
There is a feeling among some in your party that the Prime Minister has capitulated with this deal to Brussels. The former Chancellor, Lord Lawson, and we know his views generally when it comes to Brexit, thinks the Prime Minister has lost her nerve, he said, and it's time to get up off our knees. There may be many voters who agree with him. What would you say to him and others who sort of espouse that sentiment?
I don't agree with that. I think if you're going to have a negotiation like this, the idea of agreeing something and then making it contingent on a final agreement is a perfectly proper and sensible way to negotiate. Clearly, we now have a pretty tough negotiation on the free trade deal ahead of us. I think we need to make it perfectly clear that we are prepared to leave without one if one isn't offered to us that's acceptable. I think that means all the preparations the government is already making, in which Philip Hammond provided money to make in his budget, for leaving without an agreement if we can't get an acceptable one. And I think, therefore, we have a sensible negotiation ahead of us.
Right. Was it wise, then, for David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, to talk about the deal as a statement of intent only, which seems to have upset some in Brussels and in Ireland, because the implication there is that Phase 2 could unpick everything that's been agreed in Phase 1?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between two propositions. The government has clearly reached an agreement about how it will proceed in relation to withdrawal if it gets a trade deal that is acceptable.
So it is possible
It's contingent on that, but it doesn't mean that the government's going to go back and renegotiate all the terms of this text as part of getting a free trade deal. We get a free trade deal and we live by this text, or we don't get a free trade deal and then this text is off the table. That seems to me a perfectly clear, sensible, balancing position. You can never have a perfect position in negotiation, as I often found when I was negotiating the coalition, for example, but you can get a decent one, and I think this is one of those.
Do you see this, at this point, Richard, as a success for Theresa May? Because there were many who felt that she wouldn't actually even make it to this point as Prime Minister, and that trying to bring round the Democratic Unionists and the Irish government with the EU and the Conservatives on both wings of the party, do you see that as an achievement?
A small one. All these things are relative, aren't they? And I mean, obviously, Theresa May's had an absolutely horrible few months. So I think it's understandable that yesterday she should have introduced it on a note of sort of triumphalism. But I think it's very premature. I mean, this is the very first hurdle, isn't it? I mean, there's so much more to go. And I thought her tone yesterday was a bit over the top, to be honest. Michael Deacon in today's Telegraph is very funny about it. He likens her to a 400 metres hurdler who jumps over the very first hurdle at last and then stops to make a short speech thanking all her supporters. You couldn't have done it without their help. You know, it's very, very early days. So, yeah, I think it's pretty much overblown, as is so much of the language around this debate. I mean, Oliver, thank you for talking in plain English today. I mean, David Davis had to issue a clarification for one of his comments about the Northern Ireland border yesterday. I needed a clarification of the whole interview. I've never heard such jargon. And it seems to me that the whole debate, and God knows how you've kept your sanity over the last few months, Joe.
Well, I'm not sure I have.
Well, OK, it is arguable. I agree.
You seem quite sane.
But no, the entire debate is now absolutely being strangled by semantics. I mean, look at McDonnell yesterday. What was it he said? I have to make a note of it. It's so ridiculous that Labour doesn't want to be in the single market or the customs union, but a single market. This is Monty Python.
Right, and explaining this, obviously, to voters, which have tried to talk about how they will respond to what's happened so far. And you can understand why Robert Halfon has also said the public will go bananas if we're paying all these tens of billions of pounds, because they hadn't been prepared for it. But let's talk about the transition phase, which is presumably the next part of the negotiation, or certainly part of it. The Prime Minister's repeatedly implied she wants the UK to remain in the single market and the customs union during that period. Is that what you understand?
Yes.
Right. So will that be the status quo as is in terms of still taking laws and rules from the European Court of Justice?
Well, I think it's very clear from what she said yesterday that one of the things which is going to happen in this next phase, and I agree with you that it's early days yet, one of the things going to happen in the next phase is that the terms of that transitional period are going to be settled. And so questions like the ones you're asking will get answers during that period. We can't expect to have them yet. So, for example, the question will come up, if there is new legislation that comes along in the midst of that period, does that apply to us? Do we have to implement it within the period? And so on. There are all sorts of tricky issues. But the basic proposition is, as I understand it, and I think actually most people grasp this, that for 2 years we'd be governed broadly by the same set of rules that we're governed by at the moment. And during that period, we would implement all the changes that have been agreed in whatever deal there is, and then the new deal would apply from the
Well, I'll come on to what we'll be implementing in just a moment. But let's just make this clear, because there has been a bit of confusion around this transition implementation period. Will your party sign up to her vision, and your vision then, of another 2 years of EU membership in all but name?
Well, I think people would be very happy if they knew that there was a free trade deal on the table that was acceptable, which there isn't at the moment, but if there is in due course, and we'd only have this transitional period if we have a free trade deal, and if they knew that it would take 2 years to fill in the details of that and to implement it, then I think we'd all be perfectly happy to see the current situation obtain until that occurred, so there was a clean break.
Yes, so the payments continue, as we discussed, freedom of movement continues, and the European Court of Justice continues.
In order to get to the point where the free trade deal clocks in smoothly and our businesses have only one change to make, which is the point that the Prime Minister keeps on making.
Yes, so you don't have a double cliff edge, as it has been talked about. The problem is, come the 29th of March 2019, the day of our departure, we won't have signed a trade deal, will we, with the EU by then?
You say that. That's not her intention. What the Prime Minister set out, I do think it's important not to add confusions from...
I'm not adding confusion. I'm looking at what's been put on the table.
Well, she was perfectly clear yesterday that her intention is, between the first step, which this is, alone, and the next step, she's going to try to negotiate two sets of things. One, the finalisation of this deal in its detail, including the finalisation of a transitional period, and a free trade deal.
Right, let me just...
Can I ask a quick question?
You can, but I just want to read...
what happens later.
Yeah, except paragraph 6, and I don't want you to obviously know that paragraph 6 of the draft European Council guidelines, but these are the guidelines for phase 2 from their side. While an agreement on a future relationship can only be finalised and concluded once the United Kingdom has become a third country, the Union will be ready to engage in preliminary and preparatory discussions with the aim of identifying an overall understanding of the framework of the future relationship. In other words, they're only going to be looking at the very start of this trade relationship. Well, that's the guidelines for the future trade relationship.
The guidelines are fine. That's not what those guidelines mean. What those guidelines mean is that in international law, and they're absolutely right, you can't sign a free trade deal between the UK and the EU until the UK has actually left the EU, because at the moment the UK is not, from their point of view, a separate country. It's part of the EU. Therefore, these words, preliminary and so on, apply.
But we won't be implementing anything, will we, in 2019?
So if we get to an agreement before 2019, March 29th, and that's all written down, then we leave at 11 p.m, I think it is, UK time, on the March the 29th. On the 30th, the UK is 30th of March 2019. The UK is an independent country. Even if governed by the transitional period, it is an independent country because it's left. And once you've left, you can sign a free trade deal. So I think what the Prime Minister is intending to do is negotiate a free trade deal, get it approved by Parliament, have it approved also on the European side by their institutions, then sign it the second we leave or a second after we leave, and then implement it during the next 2 years. Now, whether that can be achieved is, of course, a very good question.
Right.
I completely agree. we've only crossed one hurdle.
Okay.
But it's a perfectly sensible process if you can make it happen.
Except what could happen, and what looks likely to happen if you take everything in the round, Richard, is that actually there's not going to be a Brexit dividend, which has been promised, money coming back, or the ability to sign free trade deals with other countries outside the EU until past 2021.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very good expression. The dividend, I think, is on hold. The question that I just wanted to ask you, as an experienced negotiator that you are, and we talk about this first hurdle having been straddled, do you sense that Brussels did blink?
I don't think it's exactly a question of either side blinking. I think there was some uncompromising language from Brussels, which looks like it gave way to a more sensible negotiating position. I don't think that's really a question of blinking. I think what happens is, in the course of negotiations like this, you're playing to two audiences. You're dealing inside the room with, grown-up to grown-up, a sensible set of propositions, and then you've got an audience out there that you've got to sort of make feel you're being strong and so on. And so these overblown statements which you referred to and which you're referring to get made, and one shouldn't pay too much attention to those. There'll be lots, in the next year, I guess, there'll be lots of people writing...
Noise and fury of war,
noise and fury. Yeah. The question is, at the end, do you get a sensible agreement?
Just very briefly, Dominic Grieve told the BBC this morning, so far the government has been intransigent, and he's still planning to put his amendment on a meaningful vote for MPs on the final deal tomorrow, which could mean a significant defeat for the government. Should the government compromise on that?
Well, again, we must distinguish between two crucially different propositions. Proposition one, MPs should have a vote on whether the final deal put before Parliament is acceptable to Parliament.
Yes, but should there be time for them to send it back to Theresa May, which is what this amendment is about?
Should we have the vote on whether it's acceptable? Yes, I think we definitely should have a vote on whether it's acceptable. So, as I understand it, as the government, and that's why the government is going to make that deal be something that's brought in a separate act. But the next question is, should we have the capacity in Parliament to thwart the will of the British people? I voted to remain, but nevertheless the British people voted to leave. Should we have the capacity to thwart that by rejecting not only the deal, but the whole process of Brexit? And my answer to that is definitely not. The public has voted to leave, we must leave. Therefore, the question is, do we leave with a deal or leave without a deal?
Is that what Dominic Grieve's trying to do, thwart the will of the British people?
I don't think Dominic's amendment actually does that. I think what Dominic's amendment does is simply to provide for us to vote on whether the deal is acceptable, and if that's all it does, then the government anyway is bringing forward legislation to do that.
Except he says the government's been intransigent, so obviously there isn't agreement on it.
Well, as I say, I don't read... I've worked with Dominic on a lot of amendments. I don't read his amendment, in this case, as it happens, the way he does.
Just finally on the EU withdrawal bill, why is it necessary for the date of our departure to be written into and on the face of that bill?
I don't think it's necessary, but at the same time, I don't think it's a problem. If you write in a date, and it turns out at the last moment that it's actually useful to have another, 48 hours or week or month or whatever, you can easily have emergency legislation passed in 24 hours to change the date. So,
or you could drop that amendment.
You can do either. I think the advantage of having the date on the face of it is just to allay any suspicion that Parliament is intent on doing anything other than actually leaving on the 29th of March at 11 p.m. And that, I think, is pretty important to the British people because they voted for that. And, in the end, I know this is an incredibly heterodox view. I think that this whole question of whether we leave the EU or don't leave the EU and so on is important, but much secondary to lots of other things. It's certainly secondary to whether we maintain a democracy in this country. People have to have faith in democracy.
All right.